We're going to jump right into this one. If I imagine a scenario where the United States goes to war with Iran, and I don't see a contained regional conflict, I see a geopolitical shockwave that ripples through every layer of the international system. At the center of that storm is Iran, and its most powerful military instrument, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the organization that is not just fighting force, but a political and economic pillar embedded in the deep inside of Iran's state structure. A war would not simply target military assets, it would threaten the internal balance of power in Iran, potentially strengthening and hardlining factions that thrive under external pressures while weakening reformist voices. Now, the IRGC will likely shift into an asymmetric warfare mode, cyber operations, proxy conflicts, and distributions to shipping lanes, turning the conflict into a distributed confrontation that extends far beyond the conventional battlefield. Now, from the perspective of the United States, such a war would test the limits of the global alliance and military logistics, and any sustained campaign in the Persian Gulf and immediately raise the stakes for energy security, especially around the Straits of Hormuz, a choke point through which a significant portion of the world's oil flows. Every limited disruption there could be a trigger which spikes in global energy prices, feeding inflation across continents and straining already fragile post-pandemic economies. However, the markets react not just to damage, but to uncertainty, and a prolonged confrontation would inject both into global trade systems. Now, for Israel, the implication would be existential and immediate. Israel would likely face heightened threats from proxy groups aligned with Iran, raising the risk for multi-front escalation. Its security calculus would tighten, drawing in intelligence and defense cooperation with all the Western powers while increasing regional polarization. Neighboring states would be forced into delicate diplomatic balancing acts, some quietly and some supporting containment of Iran, while others fearing domestic backlash and regional destabilization. Beyond the Middle East, the economic consequences would be global. Europe and Asia is heavily dependent on stable energy imports, which would feel the shock through higher fuel costs and disrupted supply chains. With the emerging markets already sensitive to commodity volatility, could see currency pressure and capital flight. Defense spending would likely rise worldwide, as well as diverting resources of social and developmental priorities. And the global institutions would be stress tested as major powers debated the intervention, the sanctions, and the diplomatic off ramps. Now, in the broader geopolitical picture, the U.S. and Iran, a war would accelerate the fragmentation of the international order. Rival powers might exploit the distraction to advance their own regional agendas, while non state actors could capitalize on instability. The conflict would not just redraw security alignments in the Middle East, it would reshape the perceptions and deterrence of the alliance credibility and the cost of the confrontation in a multipolar world. And as the economies absorb the shock and energy of the volatility and the market fear, ordinary citizens far from the battlefield would feel the consequences in prices and jobs and political stability. Now, in that sense, such a war would be a less regional episode and more of a global inflection point, one that forces every nation to recalibrate how it navigates security, economics, and diplomacy in an increasingly interconnected era. And when I step back and widen the lens even further, that stays with the realization that a conflict on this scale would just be another chapter of regional rivalry. It would be a defining stress test for the architecture of the modern world. We live inside systems that were built to assumptions, to relevate stability, predictable shipping lanes, enforceable international norms, and the idea that the major powers will calculate costs carefully enough to avoid cascading disasters. A war involving the United States and Iran would shake those assumptions at their foundations. Energy markets would simply spike and settle. They could enter prolonged volatility that reshapes industrial planning while also accelerating the search of alternative energy, and it deepens inequality between nations that can absorb the price shocks and those that cannot. The insurance markets, shipping industries, and global finance would also repay a price risk in real time, and that repricing would trickle down into everything from food costs to infrastructure investment. At the same time, I keep thinking about how the conflicts like this compress political timelines. Governments that were already navigating the domestic polarization would somehow suddenly be making rapid decisions under pressure from frightened populations and reactive markets. Democracies would debate the trade-offs between security and civil liberties, while authoritarian governments might use the instability to justify tighter internal controls. International institutions would be forced into the spotlight, which is asked to mediate sanctions or to coordinate humanitarian responses at a pace of the test and their legitimacy. And in that environmental narratives become as powerful as missiles, the information warfare propaganda and competing diplomatic storylines would race across digital networks, shaping public opinion and influencing policies in ways that are hard to reverse once set in motion. There is also a generational dimension that I can't ignore. Younger populations around the world would inherit the long tail of such a conflict. Elevated debt from defense spending, altered energy strategies, and a geopolitical climate that feels more fragmented and suspicious. Businesses would hedge against geopolitical risks with new supply chains, architectures potentially accelerating the decoupling of the economic blocs. That fragmentation could reduce the efficiency and the growth in the short term, but it might also push innovation as a nation's race to secure technological and resource independence. The question is whether that innovation would outpace the instability credited by the initial shock. And beneath all the microeconomics and strategy, there are human constants that runs. And beneath all the macroeconomics and strategy, there's a human constant that runs through every scenario I imagine. Uncertainty, families, workers, and communities everywhere would be navigating the world that suddenly feels like it's less predictable. Travel patterns would change and migration pressures could increase, and the humanitarian system would be stretched by displacement and reconstruction needs. The psychological impacts of living through another major international conflict, amplified by real-time media and social platforms, would shape how societies perceive risk and cooperation for years afterwards. In many ways, the aftermath would be as consequential as the conflict itself, determining whether nations double down on rivalry or rediscover incentives for diplomacy. So finally, when being of this together that I see is more than a hypothetical war, I see it as a crossroads moment that forces every country to reconsider how interdependent we really are, and how prepared we are to manage the consequences of a confrontation in a tightly coupled global system. These aren't abstract strategic games, they're decisions that echo through the economies, institutions, and everyday lives. That's why I believe conversations like this have to be had to go beyond headlines and into the deeper mechanics of power, risk, and responsibility. And that's exactly what I'm here to keep exploring with you, connecting the dots, questioning the assumptions, and examining the forces that shape our shared future. Here on the Unfiltered Political Lens Podcast. Thank you, and until next time, peace.